When Karoline Leavitt told Jasmine Crockett to go back to the zoo on live television, millions expected outrage, but what Crockett said instead left even her harshest critics completely silent. The lights were bright. The cameras locked on four panelists sat around a gleaming desk on a Thursday night episode of Nation View, one of the most watched live political shows in the country. It was supposed to be another fiery debate, one of those sessions where people interrupt each other, make sharp points, maybe get clipped for social media. But that night, something crossed the line. Jasmine Crockett, the Democratic representative from Texas, had just started building her argument about racial profiling and the long-standing disparities in police stops. She wasn't shouting. She wasn't emotional, just steady and direct. And when we look at the numbers, it's not even a question of perception. It's happening over and over again, and people like me don't need to read it in a study, we live it. That's when Karoline Leavitt leaned back in her chair. She exhaled with this smirk that felt more like a statement than any word she could have said. But then she did speak quietly, almost like she thought her mic wasn't hot. Go back to the zoo. It was clear it was cold, and it cut through the air like broken glass. At first there was just confusion. The host blinked, one of the producers standing off camera. Instinctively stepped forward, a sound technician looked up from his panel, his mouth half open. Then came the gasp. Sharp collective human. Someone whispered. Did she just... Jasmine sat still. Her hands didn't move, her face didn't change, but her eyes. Her eyes locked onto Karoline like they had known this moment was coming. Long before it arrived, no one spoke for a full 4 seconds. The silence wasn't awkward, it wasn't accidental. It was loaded heavy. It said everything. No one else could. Then Jasmine inhaled not a big breath, just enough, and she said, "Calm and even, Karoline. I've been called worse by better." The host blinked again. Someone at the desk shifted in their seat. The live feed was still rolling. Millions were watching. Jasmine leaned forward slightly, her voice steady. "I won't waste energy explaining to you why that comment's disgusting. I know why you said it, and more importantly, you know why you said it. But I do want to say this because there are little girls watching tonight who look like me." She looked at the camera. "You're not animals. You're not someone else's joke. You don't come from cages, you come from strength. From people who survived things they were never meant to survive and still stood up straight afterward. You're worthy, always have been." The room was still quiet, but it was no longer frozen. Now it was full charged. Karoline didn't speak. She looked to the side, fingers tapping the desk in a twitchy rhythm, eyes flicking toward her publicist behind the camera. Jasmine turned back to her fellow panelist, finishing her sentence, and when people say the loud part out loud like that, it's not a mistake, it's a mirror. The host, clearly shaken, tried to pivot to a break, but the damage, or maybe the revelation, had already happened. The segment ended, but the story didn't. But outside that studio, the storm had already started brewing, and no one was ready for how far it would go. The moment the show cut to commercial, the studio exploded not in volume but in motion. Producers rushed the floor. The host whispered into his earpiece. A security guard positioned near the stage looked uncertain. Caught between protocol and disbelief, Karoline reached for her water bottle, but missed the cap. Her hand was shaking. She didn't say a word. Jasmine stayed seated, still poised, her fingers gently pressed together as if she were holding something fragile. Her breath was measured, but inside her thoughts were moving fast, too fast to catch all at once. A young production assistant, maybe 25, approached Jasmine with hesitation. "Would you like to step off set for a moment?" Jasmine turned to her slowly. "No, I'm all right. Are you sure?" She nodded. "I've been here before, just not in front of this many cameras." The assistant paused, unsure what to say. Then he just nodded and walked away. Meanwhile, Karoline's team huddled in the far corner, whispering in frantic tones. Phones were out, messages were flying. Someone was already drafting a statement, even as Karoline sat in silence now, understanding that one careless phrase was about to follow her much longer than anything she'd meant to say. Back in the control room, a senior producer stared at the playback footage. She said it clear as day. She murmured to herself, no stutter, no sarcasm. that Mike picked up every syllable the segment hadn't even finished airing before clips began circulating on TikTok, and YouTube viewers had recorded the moment from their televisions. The insult, Jasmine's response, her stare the camera's tight focus in. Under 10 minutes, the clip was trending in 8 major cities by the time the show returned from commercial. People weren't talking about police reform anymore. They were talking about that moment back on set. Jasmine was asked if she'd like to continue the discussion. She looked at the host, then at Karoline, who still hadn't spoken. "I will," Jasmine said, "but only if this next part's about real things. Not games," and the host, visibly uncomfortable, agreed, but Jasmine didn't take the bait that followed. She didn't retaliate, she didn't weaponize her position or demand an apology. Instead, she told a story. "When I was 9, she began. My teacher refused to put my picture on the wall with the other kids because she said, my braids made me look messy. I came home crying. My grandmother sat me down and told me, there are people who need you to believe you belong behind a fence. Don't help them build it." She let that hang in the air ever since then. I've known that every insult isn't just about me, it's about the people watching. Especially the ones who think silence is the only option. It's not. No one interrupted her. Karoline didn't make eye contact, she simply stared straight ahead. Her knuckles pressed against her lips, the show ended quietly. No recap, no clever closing banter. Just the credits and the silence that always follows something real. But Jasmine's words didn't fade with the outro music, they stayed echoed, picked up and carried by people across the country who'd heard something more than just a comeback. But while the cameras turned off, the internet was just waking up and it didn't plan to sleep anytime soon. By the time Jasmine got to her car, her phone had already frozen twice. Not from battery issues, just too many notifications all at once. Texts, DMS, missed calls, tagged videos. Some were from friends checking in. Some from journalists. One was from her college roommate who hadn't called in 12 years. She sat in the passenger seat screen, glowing in her lap but didn't touch it. Her driver, Tony, a quiet man in his late 50s, looked at her through the rearview mirror. "You okay?" She glanced up. "Yeah, just tired," he nodded. "You want music?" "No," she said softly. Not yet. Across the country, televisions in diners, waiting rooms, barbershops, and living rooms had shown the same thing by 9:48 p.m. Someone had uploaded a full HD clip of the insult and response to YouTube. It hit 250,000 views within the first half hour. That same clip made its way to Twitter now. X, where one user captioned it, "This is what Grace under fire looks like soon." Reactions poured in. Some were angry. "I can't believe she said that on live TV, fired." Now some were exhausted. "Every time we try to talk about real issues, they try to dehumanize us still in 2025. Some were thoughtful. "I didn't agree with Jasmine Crockett on anything before tonight, but she showed restraint and leadership I haven't seen in a long time." But not all voices were kind. Karoline's defenders spun hard. Some claimed she was misheard. Others said the clip was doctored. One person tried to argue. She meant it metaphorically, but it was too late. The audio was clear, the words were there. Even people who normally stood with Karoline looked uncomfortable. A few conservative commentators issued carefully worded statements about maintaining civility, never naming her directly. And then there were the memes. The internet doesn't rest. Screenshots of Jasmine's stare text, overlays reaction videos, a slow-motion zoom in on the moment she said, "I've been called worse by better." That phrase started showing up everywhere. On t-shirts, on pins. One designer on Etsy started selling hoodies with those words by midnight and had 600 orders before sunrise. Jasmine finally scrolled through a few posts in the back seat. She wasn't smiling, she didn't feel victorious. It wasn't a win, it was just another moment in a very long line of moments. She called her mother. "I'm fine," she said as soon as her mom picked up. "You sure?" "Yes." Her mom exhaled. "You know, your great-grandfather couldn't even look a white woman in the eye without getting whipped. And you just looked dead into that camera and told the whole nation the truth." "I just wish I didn't have to, I know, baby," her mother said. "But you handled it the way only you could." At the same time, Caroline sat alone in a downtown hotel suite in Philadelphia where the show had been filmed. Her phone was buzzing, but for different reasons. Her manager had texted 3 times. Say nothing, don't post, let me handle this. Her mother, who usually avoided politics, sent a one-line message that hit harder than any headline. Caroline, why would you say something like that? She didn't reply instead. She turned off her phone and stared out at the city lights, watching the reflection of her own face in the window glass. For once, there were no sound bites, no rehearsed lines, just her and the silence. But silence doesn't erase things, and tomorrow it was going to get louder. 7 hours earlier, Jasmine Crockett had been standing in front of her hotel bathroom mirror, tugging at a stubborn strand of hair that wouldn't stay down. She wasn't nervous. Not exactly, but there was something about live television that always made her double-check her appearance one more time than necessary. The makeup artist had already left the room, smelled faintly of setting spray and lavender lotion. Her phone buzzed beside the sink. A text from her aide, Danny Carr, downstairs. You're early if you want to get some quiet before it starts. Jasmine stared at her reflection. She didn't have the look of someone gearing up for a viral moment. No speech tucked in her blazer. No gotcha lines rehearsed in front of a mirror. Just a small stack of handwritten notes in her purse. A few facts she wanted to remember. In case the conversation veered into dangerous territory, she did what she always did before high-pressure appearances. She whispered to herself low enough so only she could hear. You've been through more than this. This ain't new. She remembered the first time she ever sat in a courtroom. Not as a lawyer, as a little girl sitting beside her uncle while he fought to keep custody of her cousin. She remembered the cold benches, the judge who never once looked up, and the lawyer on the other side who kept saying things like, those people in that neighborhood. She didn't know it then, but that moment carved something into her, a kind of quiet fire, the kind that doesn't flash. It just stays lit as the car rolled through downtown Philadelphia. Jasmine looked out the window. She saw a father walking with his daughter, both wearing matching jackets. A young man in a delivery uniform on a bike. A woman arguing with someone on speakerphone near a corner store. Life kept moving. She thought about what she was going to say on the show that night. Not just the numbers or the policies. The why behind the debate. Why these conversations felt like they hit deeper for some people and barely scratched the surface for others in the green room. Just before going on set, Jasmine sipped water and read through a few lines of notes. Caroline walked in 10 minutes later, flanked by 2 assistants. She didn't say hello. Didn't make eye contact. Jasmine wasn't surprised the two had shared panels before, but never. Like this, Caroline always came in like she was walking into a fight she planned to win before it even started. Always polished, always a little smug. Jasmine had learned early on that people like that didn't scare her. They frustrated her, but they didn't shake her. One of the producers walked in. 5 minutes, ladies. Just a heads up. We're going live, right from segment 1. No warm-up topics. Jasmine nodded. Caroline just checked her phone, then it was time the crew LED them into the studio. Bright lights, cold air. Jasmine took her seat, adjusting her mic. She looked out past the cameras, not at the host, not at the audience, at the lens, the millions of eyes that would be on her. She felt calm, clear. Caroline leaned over just before the mics went hot and said, "Let's try to keep it civilized this time." Jasmine gave her a faint smile. That's always the goal, isn't it? She didn't know yet how that night would change the trajectory of the conversation, how a single off-the-cuff insult would push her response into history books, class discussions, and living room debates. She didn't need to know. All she knew was that when it came time to speak, she wouldn't flinch. But across the studio, someone else was getting ready too, and her words would flip the script in ways she never saw coming. Karoline Leavitt had built a reputation on sharp sound bites and calculated jabs. She knew how to provoke a reaction, how to stir things just enough to keep her followers fired up, and her name trending for her politics was performance strategy control. But nothing about what she said that night was planned. When she mouthed those words, "Go back to the zoo," she hadn't thought about cameras or microphones. It came out like muscle memory. A reflex she didn't know was sitting right below the surface. And the second it left her mouth, she felt something she hadn't felt on air in a long time. Regret, not remorse, not right away. Just that cold, sinking realization that she'd said something. You can't rewind after the show ended? She locked herself in her hotel room. Her phone lit up nonstop. Missed calls from her team emails marked urgent. Her communications director, Alan, had texted 3 times before she even got back upstairs. Don't tweet. We need to talk before anything goes public. This is going to be bad. She poured herself a drink, sat on the edge of the bed, listened to the muted sounds of the city coming through the glass, and for once she didn't speak down the hall. Alan was pacing in his own sweet phone to his ear. Her face is everywhere, he told their media consultant. I'm telling you, this one's different. She didn't just offend people. She confirmed something ugly that's a whole different category. They debated releasing a pre-written apology, something vague and measured, but they knew it wouldn't hold. The insult was specific. The audio was clear, and the backlash wasn't just from the usual corners. People on both sides of the aisle were calling it disgusting by morning. Several prominent donors had quietly backed out of upcoming events. Karoline was scheduled to headline a state college uninvited her from a campus forum. One morning show canceled her next appearance. It was a domino effect. Karoline's manager insisted on crafting a public statement. Something remorseful but distant. She refused. If I say I'm sorry, she snapped. It'll look like I'm admitting I'm racist. Alan gave her a long look. You said something racist. Karoline, whether you meant to or not, this isn't about looking like anything anymore. It is what it is. She didn't respond. He continued slower this time. You can either own it and try to repair it or double down and let this become your legacy. She swallowed hard. They're going to cancel me either way. Alan shook his head. No, they're going to remember you, and you get to choose how she didn't sleep that night. Her usual confidence, the shield she wore so comfortably, had a crack running right down the center. She thought back to her high school days in Portsmouth, the quiet things people said, the jokes her classmates told when no one was listening. She had laughed back then, not because it was funny, but because it was easier. And maybe that was the problem she'd never really questioned. The wiring never bothered to pull it apart, just move forward with it, assuming it was normal. Now the wiring had gone live and it shocked the whole country. She looked at the clip again on her phone. Jasmine's face, the silence, her own voice saying something she couldn't unsay. There was no outrage in Jasmine's response, no shouting, no theatrics, just truth. And that somehow hurt more than any screaming match would have. Karoline turned off the screen, but as she sat in silence trying to manage damage, the rest of the country was waking up and they had something to say the morning after the broadcast. Things didn't calm down. They intensified cable news shows. LED with the story, not the latest polling numbers, not a foreign policy update, but that clip, the insult, the response. The Stair in Phoenix, a group of high school students paused their morning civics lesson when a teacher wheeled in a cart with the video queued up. We're going to talk about this today, she said, because it's not just about politics. It's about the world you're walking into in Baltimore. An older man at a diner passed his phone across the counter to his barber, shaking his head slowly. I've heard worse, but not on live TV like that, and never with so much grace in return in Madison, Wisconsin. A church youth group gathered in the community room to watch the full exchange together. No one spoke until the end. Then a teenager raised her hand and asked, "Why are people still saying things like that?" No one had an easy answer. The thing that made the moment spread wasn't just the insult. It was the fact that Jasmine had responded in a way most people couldn't imagine themselves managing. Not without snapping. Not without fury. The restraint made it more powerful and more painful on social media. The discussions deepened. Hashtags emerged not from cages hashered. Grace under fire hash, I am not your joke. People shared their own stories, microaggressions at work, sideways glances in stores, jokes that weren't funny. It stopped being just about Jasmine and Karoline. It became a mirror in small towns and cities across the country. People were forced to ask uncomfortable questions. Not about who was right or wrong, but about how much ugliness was still floating, just beneath the surface about how easily it came out. One clip showed a father and daughter sitting on a porch in Mobile, Alabama. The father had tears in his eyes as he explained to his 10-year-old why those words hurt so much because, baby, they used to put us in cages, literally, and call us animals. And sometimes the words don't sound new. They sound like echoes. Even people who had never heard of Jasmine Crockett before now knew her name. Not because she demanded it, because she showed up without raising her voice and still made people listen. And then came the op-eds. Some praised her response as dignified. Others accused her of being too calm, of letting Karoline off the hook. But Jasmine wasn't online defending herself. She stayed silent, watching from the outside. She knew the danger of being too available in moments like this. Too reactive, too quick to engage. Sometimes the power is in letting people sit with what they've heard. Meanwhile, Karoline's team went into overdrive. Her camp released a written apology late that afternoon. It used all the expected words: regret, misunderstood. Not representative of my values, but no video, no voice, just typed lines that didn't land. Not even close. Even some of her longtime supporters hesitated to defend her. One conservative radio host said on air, "This isn't cancel culture, folks. This is consequences. There's a difference." The weight of the moment stretched beyond politics. It wasn't about party lines anymore. It was about what people accepted as normal and what they finally refused to ignore. And for every loud voice online, there were quiet ones. Offline friends talking in break rooms, grandparents shaking their heads at breakfast tables, teenagers whispering in locker rooms. Did you see that video? They weren't quoting Karoline, they were quoting Jasmine. But while the country was still reeling from what was said, the network behind it all was starting to feel the heat too. And they weren't ready for the backlash coming straight for them behind the polished glass exterior of the Nation View headquarters in downtown Philadelphia. Tensions spilled through every hallway. It was barely 10 a.m., but 3 emergency meetings had already taken place and more were coming. Producers, executives, advertisers. Everyone was on edge internally. The clip was referred to as Segment 4. Incident emails came with subject lines like urgent response needed, and crisis comms planning. The network's social media director hadn't left her office in hours, trying to monitor what was being said while drafting 3 possible public statements, each with different levels of ownership. The host of the show, Paul Banner, was livid. He was known for keeping things civil, even under pressure, and had built a brand on equal airtime for every voice. But this wasn't about balance anymore. He'd sat just 5 feet away when it happened. He heard it live, and what haunted him wasn't the words. It was the silence right after I froze, he said in the first staff meeting. I should have addressed it right then. That's on me. One junior producer suggested cutting Karoline from future broadcasts until things calm down. Another pushed back. If we do that, her fans will say we're silencing conservative voices. And if we don't, someone else replied, we're saying racism's just another opinion. The room went quiet outside the studio. Bubble sponsors were already reacting. 3 pulled advertising within 24 hours. One major tech company emailed their statement directly. We cannot support programming that allows racially charged language to go unchecked on national television. Executives debated whether to air an apology at the start of the next episode or issue one online. The legal team warned against letting anyone from the network speak freely about the situation on air. But Paul insisted if I don't say something, I become complicit. They reached a compromise. A short monologue, carefully reviewed, delivered by Paul. Just enough to acknowledge what happened, without admitting liability that night. The show opened without its usual theme music. Paul sat alone at the desk. He took a moment before speaking. Last night, something was said on this program that shouldn't have been. It was hurtful. It was wrong. And while we can't take it back, we can take responsibility for what happens next. The clip of his remarks went viral, but not like Jasmine's had. It wasn't raw, it wasn't real. It felt edited, padded, safe, viewers noticed. One commenter wrote, if this is your version of accountability, you've missed the point behind the scenes. Mid-level producers were talking about what they weren't allowed to say. One even leaked an internal memo to a journalist, revealing that network executives initially wanted to limit references to racial context when covering the backlash that leak sparked a second wave of outrage by. Day 3 calls for transparency grew louder. Editorial staff sent an anonymous letter to upper management, demanding clearer policies on hate speech during live broadcasts. They also asked whether guests like Karoline would face any consequences or just move on as if nothing had happened. The pressure built from all sides. Paul pushed for an open segment, inviting Jasmine back, giving her space to speak without interruption. The network hesitated too risky. They said we don't know what she might say. That's exactly why we should let her say it. Paul replied in the end. Jasmine agreed to return, but on one condition: no scripted back and forth, no debate panel. Just her sitting across from Paul. One-on-one, the network reluctantly approved they needed the ratings, and deep down they knew. Avoiding her voice now would only make things worse, but when Jasmine stepped back onto that stage, she wasn't there to settle scores. She came with something heavier. The truth nobody had said out loud, yet the studio was quieter than usual. No buzzing crew, no chatter, just 2 chairs, a single table between them, and the kind of silence that didn't need to be explained. Jasmine Crockett walked out slowly, wearing a dark blue blazer and calm on her face. Not the rehearsed kind, the kind that comes from knowing exactly who you are, no matter what anyone else says. Paul Banner stood to greet her. They shook hands not stiffly, but with something unspoken in the gesture. A kind of recognition. The cameras went live. No intro music, no graphics. Just Paul's voice tonight. We do something different. No debate, no interruptions. Just space for reflection, for response. He turned to Jasmine. Thank you for being here, she nodded. Thank you for the space. He leaned back slightly. You don't need me to guide this. What would you like to say? She didn't rush. She looked straight into the camera. I've had a few days to think about what happened. She began, and I want to make something clear. What Karoline said wasn't just about me, it was about a deep, ugly wound this country hasn't healed from. She folded her hands. I've sat in rooms where people flinched when I walked in. I've been spoken over, doubted, reduced to a punchline, but what made that moment different wasn't the insult. It was how normal it felt to the person who said it. That should scare all of us. Paul didn't say anything. He didn't need to. Jasmine continued, see, racism isn't always hooded and loud. Sometimes it smiles at you on the elevator. Sometimes it dresses well and sits beside you on national television. Sometimes it slips out when someone forgets the mic is still on. She paused. I didn't clap back. I didn't yell. Not because I didn't want to, but because I've learned that rage burns fast and I need people to hear me longer than that. She looked down for a second, then back up. This isn't just about Karoline. This is about all the rooms where someone gets dehumanized and no one says anything. This is about the kids who hear that kind of language and think it's a joke. This is about history repeating itself while we pretend it's all in the past. For the first time, Paul leaned forward. You've been flooded with support, but also criticism. Some say you should have called her out harder. Others say you overreacted. What do you say to that? Jasmine looked at him. I say I don't need to meet ugliness on its level. I've been taught how to stand taller than that. My grandmother used to say if someone throws mud at you, don't hand them the bucket. Paul smiled faintly. You think anything will change? I think it already has. She said not everywhere, but in pockets. People are talking. People who used to stay silent. Sometimes change doesn't start with a bang, it starts with a mirror. He nodded slowly after a few moments. Paul asked one final question if Karoline were watching right now. What would you say Jasmine thought for a second? Then she said, I'd say, I hope this shook you. Not because I want you punished, but because I want you to grow. And if this was your moment to learn, I hope you take it, because the rest of us, we've had to learn our whole lives. The studio stayed silent as the feed ended. No applause, no summary, just a quiet fade to black. But the internet didn't fade. Her words caught fire all over again, and not in the sensational way. In the steady building way, people reposted clips with captions like, "This is leadership? This is how you teach without preaching." She didn't flinch, and Caroline, she watched the whole thing from a hotel room this time, without saying a word. But Jasmine's message wasn't finished yet because some moments echo, long after the cameras stop rolling. Weeks passed, the viral clip slowed down, the headlines shifted, and the internet moved on like it always does. But something stuck in a middle school classroom in Toledo. A social studies teacher replayed Jasmine's speech during a media literacy unit. After the video ended, a student in the back raised her hand and asked, "Why didn't she just cuss her out?" The teacher paused, then said, "Because sometimes strength isn't about the loudest voice. It's about knowing when to speak and how." In a community center in Oakland, a local pastor opened his Sunday sermon. Not with a verse, but with a quote, "Don't hand them the bucket." The congregation nodded, murmured, leaned in. They understood, and in a bookstore in St. Louis, a stack of new T-shirts sat folded near the register. Each one printed with the same words, "Not from cages, from strength." Jasmine never chased the attention. She didn't book a press tour. She didn't try to monetize the moment she returned to her work committee. Hearings, district meetings, policy calls, but everywhere she went, someone stopped her. Not for autographs, not even for photos, just to say thank you. Older women hugged her and whispered, "You made us proud." Teenagers told her, "I didn't know you before this, but now I do." A man at an airport gate once handed her a note written on the back of a boarding pass. It said, "My daughter watched you. She asked questions we've never talked about before. Thank you for opening that door." Caroline, meanwhile, went quiet. She didn't disappear, but she didn't resurface in the same way. Either her next scheduled media appearances were canceled. A planned book deal quietly dissolved. A handful of donors turned to newer, safer faces for a while. She avoided public events entirely. Then one day she appeared alone at a town hall in Des Moines, Iowa. No press, no crowd of staffers. Just her, a microphone, and 30 folding chairs. She didn't speak about ratings or sound bites. She didn't dodge. She stood in front of a small audience and said, "I made a comment that hurt people. I don't expect forgiveness from everyone, but I want them to understand the weight of what I said. I came here tonight to listen." Some rolled their eyes, others crossed their arms, but a few stayed after just to talk. Maybe that was the start of something, maybe not, but Jasmine, she didn't need that closure. Her story wasn't about revenge or redemption. It was about clarity, and clarity has a way of leaving its mark in that now infamous panel moment. She didn't change her tone, she didn't raise her voice, but she shifted the energy in a room and eventually across the country by standing still and speaking truth. She reminded people what grace looks like when it's earned, not rehearsed. She reminded people that silence after a slur is a choice, and so is dignity. And she reminded every girl who's ever been mocked, dismissed, or talked down to that their worth isn't defined by someone else's microphone. Not now, not ever. Sometimes the loudest mic drop is the one where you don't drop the mic at all. You just keep holding it steady in your hand while the whole world finally stops and listens. If you felt that story, if it moved you, if it made you think, subscribe to the channel. We'll keep telling the stories that matter. The ones that make people talk, feel, and grow.